When I stepped into the room, every head turned, but I didn't care about them. On me was a tight, red dress with a neckline that left just enough to the imagination but not too much. My mother would have hated it. But the way my stepfather's eyes locked onto me, I couldn't help the shiver that ran down my spine. His gaze lingered, heavy and deliberate, and for the first time, I felt something I shouldn't have. Something dangerous. Hi, I'm Bella. I'm 22 years old, and this is the story of how one New Year's Eve turned my entire life upside down. Frank, my stepfather, is the kind of man who commands attention wherever he goes. At 60, he's in better shape than most men half his age. Broad shoulders, a firm jawline, and silver-streaked hair that makes him look like he walked off the cover of a luxury magazine. When he speaks, people listen. When he looks at you, it's like he sees right through you. I'd always thought he was perfect for my mom, stable, successful, and respectful. But tonight, as his eyes followed me across the room, I realized there was more to him than the polished exterior. And for the first time, I wondered if he wasn't just a husband to my mom, but a man with his own desires. The party was in full swing. My mom was busy entertaining guests, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. The champagne was flowing, and the atmosphere was warm with the glow of the fire and soft, festive music. But all I could feel was the weight of Frank's eyes on me. I tried to shake it off. He's just being protective, I told myself. He's your stepdad. Don't be ridiculous. But something in his gaze made my stomach flip, not with fear, but with something much harder to admit. At one point, I caught him leaning against the bar, watching me with a faint smirk as I danced with a friend. His whiskey glass tilted slightly in his hand, and his eyes held a challenge. It wasn't just me imagining it anymore. I decided to test the waters. After all, wasn't this all just harmless fun? I walked to the bar, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and leaned in to grab a glass of champagne. I could feel his gaze burn into me, the tension thick in the air. Having fun? He asked, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent a chill down my spine. Of course, I replied, glancing at him with what I hoped was a casual smile. You? His eyes didn't leave mine. Let's just say the view has been captivating tonight. I froze for a moment, my heart racing. Was I imagining the double meaning? Or was he really saying what I thought he was saying? Before I could respond, my mom's voice called from across the room, breaking the moment. Frank straightened, his expression shifting back to the composed, charming man everyone knew him to be. But that moment stayed with me. The way he said captivating felt like it was meant for me, not just the party. Later that evening, I slipped out onto the balcony for some air. The cold wind was a welcome relief against my flushed cheeks. I stared at the stars, trying to calm the storm inside me. Then I heard the sound of the door behind me sliding open. I thought I'd find you here, Frank said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. I turned, my heart pounding. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking every bit the confident, powerful man I'd always seen him as. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. Needed a break? He asked, stepping closer. Yeah, I said, trying to steady my voice. It's a little overwhelming in there. He nodded, standing beside me now, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold night air. Bella, he said, his tone softer now, you've grown into a remarkable woman. I don't think I've told you that enough. I swallowed hard. There it was again, that edge to his words that made it impossible to ignore. Thanks, I said quietly, not daring to meet his gaze. Careful, though, he continued, his voice dropping lower. You play with fire in a dress like that. His words hung in the air between us, charged and impossible to ignore. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Maybe I like the heat, I replied before I could stop myself, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened slightly, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. He didn't say anything more, just turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone with my racing heart and 1,000 questions. That night, I lay in bed, replaying every moment. Every word. Every look. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And trust me, what happens next? You won't want to miss it. The room buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but my focus was elsewhere. Frank's eyes. They were on me again. Every time I glanced his way, he was watching me, his expression unreadable but intense. It wasn't a casual glance, nor one of disinterest. It was heavy, deliberate, and it made my stomach flutter in a way I didn't want to admit. As I made my way through the crowd, our paths crossed at the doorway to the kitchen. I barely had time to react before his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't a firm grip, just a fleeting touch. But it lingered long enough to send a shiver up my spine. "You're stealing the show tonight," he said, his voice low and smooth, like a melody only I could hear. I laughed nervously, trying to play it cool. "It's just a dress, Frank." He smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't just polite. "No, Bella. It's you." My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Was I imagining this? Surely, I had to be. He was my stepfather, for God's sake. But the way he looked at me, it wasn't fatherly. I mumbled something about needing a drink and slipped away, my pulse racing. As the night wore on, the party began to wind down. Guests trickled out, one by one, leaving behind a quiet hum of conversation and the faint smell of champagne and cigars. My mother, ever the perfect hostess, was busy saying her goodbyes. I, on the other hand, was avoiding Frank like the plague. But avoiding him was impossible. I was standing by the fireplace, pretending to admire the decorations, when he appeared beside me. I didn't see him approach, he was just suddenly there, close enough that I could smell the faint hint of his cologne. "You're not leaving without saying goodnight, are you?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. I turned to him, forcing a smile. "Of course not." Just catching my breath. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I felt completely exposed, as if he could see every thought in my head. "Good," he said, his lips curling into that same enigmatic smile. "You've been the highlight of the evening, Bella." "Truly." I tried to laugh it off. "That's just the champagne talking." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "No, it's not." The air between us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. I should have stepped back, put some distance between us, but I couldn't move. His presence was magnetic, pulling me closer even as my mind screamed at me to run. Later, when most of the guests had left, I found myself sitting alone in the corner of the living room, sipping what must have been my 4th glass of champagne. My mother was upstairs, probably checking on the caterers, and the house felt eerily quiet. That's when he appeared again, leaning casually against the doorway. "Tired?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. "A little," I admitted. He walked over and sat down in the chair opposite mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was charged. "You looked incredible tonight," he said suddenly, his words catching me off guard. I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, Bella, you have a way of capturing attention without even trying. It's rare." I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "You're flattering me, Frank." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "No, just being honest." The tension between us was palpable now, like a string pulled so tight it might snap at any moment. My mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts, most of them telling me to get up and walk away. But my body refused to listen. Instead, I stayed. "Bella," he said softly, his tone dropping an octave. Do you know what happens when you play with fire? His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. What? His smile was small, almost sad. You get burned. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, every touch. What was I doing? Why was I letting this happen? And yet, as I closed my eyes, the only thing I could think about was the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his voice had dipped when he spoke my name. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, but it did little to lift the weight pressing on my chest. I tried to shake off the memories of last night, the looks, the words, the way my heart wouldn't stop racing whenever Frank was near. Just forget it, I told myself as I stared at my reflection in the mirror. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way he had looked at me like I was the only person in the room. I wandered downstairs, trying to act normal. My mom was already out running errands, and the house was unusually quiet. I decided to keep busy and grabbed a book from the shelf in the living room, but the words blurred together. My thoughts kept circling back to Frank. Get a grip of Bella, I muttered under my breath. Needing a distraction, I headed toward the kitchen, but as I passed by Frank's office, I heard his voice. I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him sitting at his desk, his focus entirely on the papers in front of him. I shouldn't have stopped. I shouldn't have lingered. But something about the sight of him, so composed, so in control, made me pause. Bella? His voice broke through my thoughts, startling me. Sorry, I stammered, stepping inside. I didn't mean to interrupt. He looked up from his work, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You're not interrupting. Come in. I hesitated, but the way he leaned back in his chair, his eyes soft yet intense, made it impossible to refuse. I stepped inside, my heartbeat quickening with every step. Everything okay? He asked, his tone casual, but his gaze told a different story. Yeah, just bored, I guess, I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He chuckled, the sound deep and smooth. Well, I don't think boredom suits you. I felt my cheeks flush, and I looked away, pretending to study the books on the shelf. You know, he said after a moment, you've grown up a lot these past few years. Sometimes I forget you're not a kid anymore. I turned back to him, unsure how to respond. Thanks. I guess. He smiled again, but this time there was something different in his expression, something that sent a chill down my spine. You're too grown up to be so innocent, Bella, he said, his voice low and deliberate. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. My face burned, and my mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to move. I should go, I mumbled, but I didn't take a step toward the door. He stood up, his tall frame suddenly making the room feel much smaller. He didn't come closer, but he didn't need to. His presence was overwhelming enough. Bella, he said softly, his tone almost gentle, sometimes, curiosity can lead to dangerous places. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What do you mean? His eyes held mine, unblinking. I think you know exactly what I mean. The air was thick with tension, so much so that I could barely breathe. My mind raced with 100 thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. But instead of running, I stayed. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was the way his voice seemed to pull me in, or the way his eyes held a challenge I wasn't ready to back away from. Whatever it was, I couldn't walk out of that room. Not yet. And if I thought last night was intense, I had no idea how much more complicated things were about to get. The tension between us was no longer something I could ignore. It was there in every glance, every word, every fleeting touch. And it wasn't just him. I wasn't innocent in this. I found myself lingering in rooms where he was, hoping for a moment of stolen silence, a look, a word that would set my pulse racing. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was wrong. But I couldn't stop. It started with small things. I'd accidentally bump into him in the hallway or find excuses to help my mom with something that would bring me closer to him. And he wasn't innocent either. His presence became more intentional. A hand brushing against mine, a compliment delivered with a smile that held a little too much weight. One evening, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. The party was over, my mom had gone to bed, and the house was wrapped in an almost eerie quiet. Frank stood by the counter, sipping a glass of wine, his shirt sleeves rolled up, exposing his strong forearms. "You're still up?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes were anything but. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, leaning against the island. His gaze flicked to me, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Something on your mind?" I hesitated, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Maybe." He set his glass down and stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "Careful, Bella. You're walking a very fine line." I met his gaze, my heart pounding. "And you're not?" For a moment, the air between us was electric, so charged it felt like the world might shatter around us. But then, he stepped back, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Another day, I was leaving the house when he caught me at the door. His hand rested lightly on the frame, blocking my way. "Where are you off to?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Just out," I said, trying to sound casual. He tilted his head, studying me. "You know, Bella, you're playing with fire." I felt a shiver run through me, but I didn't back down. "Maybe I like the heat." His smile deepened, a mix of amusement and something darker. "And what if it burns you?" I leaned in slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it doesn't?" The way he looked at me in that moment, like I was the only thing that mattered, sent a thrill through me I couldn't ignore. From that point on, the rules no longer applied. We stopped pretending this was innocent. The tension turned into something more deliberate, more dangerous. Every interaction was a dance, a push and pull that left me breathless. And I wasn't fighting it anymore. Neither was he. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. My mother had left an hour ago, off to spend the evening with her friends, and now it was just Frank and me. Alone. I tried to distract myself, to keep busy, but every sound seemed amplified in the emptiness. Every creak of the floor, every clink of a glass, it all reminded me of who was still here. Frank was sitting by the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, the flames casting a warm, golden glow over his face. He looked up when I entered the room, his eyes meeting mine with that same intensity I'd come to recognize, the one that left me breathless. "Care to join me?" he asked, his voice calm, inviting. I hesitated for a moment, but then I nodded, grabbing a glass of wine from the counter and sinking into the armchair opposite him. The fire crackled between us, but it was nothing compared to the tension in the room. We sat in silence for a while, sipping our drinks. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged, like the stillness before a storm. I could feel his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking at him. "You've been quiet tonight," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "Just thinking," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "About?" I glanced at him, my heart pounding. "A lot of things." His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Dangerous things, Bella?" I swallowed hard, unable to look away. "Maybe." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them seem darker, deeper. "You know, I've been thinking too. About how easy it is to lose control when you're around." My breath hitched. I wanted to say something, to deflect, to change the subject, but the words wouldn't come. "Frank," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Don't pretend you don't feel it too." My cheeks flushed, my hands tightening around the stem of my glass. I couldn't deny it anymore. Not to him, and not to myself. He stood up, walking around the coffee table until he was standing in front of me. I looked up at him, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to move, to leave, to do anything but stay frozen in place. But I didn't move. He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek. His touch was warm, soft, and it sent a shiver through me. "You're so beautiful, Bella," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I closed my eyes, leaning into his hand despite every rational thought telling me not to. His thumb brushed gently against my jaw, and when I opened my eyes again, his face was inches from mine. "This is wrong," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know," he replied, his breath warm against my skin. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I let him close the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both tender and consuming. The room seemed to spin as his hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me to my feet. My glass slipped from my hand, landing softly on the carpet, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was him, his touch, his warmth, the way he made me feel like the only thing that mattered. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him. My fingers found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his shirt. It was racing, just like mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop. It was just us, the firelight casting shadows on the walls, the quiet hum of the world fading away. But then reality came crashing back. It happened. That night, we crossed a line we could never uncross. Afterward, the weight of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers, while Frank stood a few feet away, his back to me. Neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. "I shouldn't have let this happen," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We both made this choice, Bella." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. It was a mistake. He didn't respond, and the silence that followed was worse than anything he could have said. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. The way his touch had set my skin on fire, the way his words had made me feel like I was the only person in the world. But alongside the thrill was an overwhelming wave of guilt and regret. I knew it was wrong, I whispered to myself in the darkness. But I couldn't stop. And now it's too late. What happens next will change everything. And trust me, the storm is just beginning. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Secrets like ours never stay hidden for long. It started with whispers. My mom's friends, her coworkers, even the house staff, someone had seen or heard something they shouldn't have. And in a house as big as ours, gossip spreads faster than wildfire. The confrontation came one evening, just as the sun was setting. I was in the living room, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when my mother stormed in. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fury. Frank followed close behind, his usual composure shaken but not entirely gone. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I froze, my heart dropping to the floor. "What?" "Don't play dumb with me, Bella," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I know everything." I looked at Frank, silently begging him to intervene, to say something that could defuse the situation. But he just stood there, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Mom, Don't," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I trusted you, Bella. I trusted you with him. And you," she turned to Frank, her anger shifting. "You were supposed to be my husband. How could you? With her?" Her words hit me like a slap, and tears welled up in my eyes. "It wasn't like that," I tried to explain, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. "Then what was it like?" she demanded, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you love her? Was it worth throwing away everything we had?" Frank finally spoke, his voice low and measured. Anna, please. Let's talk about this calmly. Calmly, she repeated, her voice rising. You destroyed our family, Frank. You both did. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to say something, to make her understand, but there was nothing I could say that would make this better. The fallout was swift and brutal. My mother packed her bags that same night, vowing never to return. Frank tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Her parting words echoed in my mind long after she slammed the door behind her. You're both dead to me. I was left standing in the wreckage of what used to be my family, my heart heavy with guilt. Frank sat on the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. For the first time, he looked small, defeated. It's over, I said quietly, breaking the silence. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. It doesn't have to be. I shook my head, my throat tight. Yes, it does. Don't you see? This was never real, Frank. It was a mistake. A game. His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Maybe he knew I was right. In the days that followed, I started to piece things together, small details I hadn't noticed before. Frank's calculated words, the way he always seemed to know exactly how to keep me hooked. It became clear that I was never more than a pawn in his game. I thought it was real, I said to myself one night, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My voice broke, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. But he was just using me. The realization was like a knife to the chest. I had risked everything, my relationship with my mother, my dignity, my sense of self, for a man who saw me as nothing more than a fleeting thrill. As I lay in bed that night, the weight of my choices pressed down on me like never before. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now I was paying the price. Frank was gone by morning. His things packed into a few suitcases, my mother standing in the doorway, her face cold and unreadable. She didn't yell, didn't cry. She simply watched as he left, her silence cutting deeper than any words could have. I stood at the top of the stairs, invisible but present, my heart pounding as the front door closed behind him. The echo of his departure hung in the air, final and suffocating. Days turned into weeks, but the house never felt the same. My mother barely looked at me. When she did, her eyes were filled with a mixture of disappointment and something worse, indifference. She stopped talking to me altogether, her coldness a punishment I couldn't escape. I spent most of my days in my room, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The looks, the words, the choices that had brought me here. Every time I saw my reflection, I had to look away. I destroyed everything, I whispered to myself one night, my voice breaking. For what? A fantasy? A lie? One evening, as I sat in the empty kitchen, the silence was broken by the soft buzz of my phone. A message. From Frank. I hope you're okay, it read. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. For a brief moment, I considered replying. But then I remembered the look in my mother's eyes, the weight of my choices, and I deleted the message without a second thought. Sitting in the quiet, I realized something that cut deeper than any guilt or regret. Frank wasn't the only one to blame. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. And now, I was left with the fallout, alone and broken. This night changed everything, I whispered, the words barely audible. If I could take it back, I would. But now, all that's left is the bitter truth. Some desires are better left untouched.